Good evening. I'm Bill Adams, principal understudy for Tom McCann, who is indisposed this evening. Welcome to tonight's Friends Speaker Series event. It is my honor to introduce internationally recognized director of opera and theater, Francesca Zambello, who will speak on her life and career. Now, if you would please take a moment to silence your cell phones or other annoying devices that you may have brought in. An American by birth, Miss Zambello grew up in Europe and is fluent in multiple languages. She attended Moscow University in 1976 and later graduated from Colgate University. Her American debut as an opera director was a 1984 Houston Grand Opera staging of Fidelio, and 3 years later, she debuted in Europe, in Venice. Ms. Zambello's skyrocketing career has included innovative and exciting productions of both theater and opera all over the world. Among her more notable opera productions are the premieres of Emmeline, An American Tragedy, Don Giovanni, The Trojans, and Carmen. Her theater projects have included the new musical Rebecca for Vienna's Raymond Theater, The Little Prince with Oscar-winning composer Rachel Portman in Houston, and Napoleon in London's West End. Currently, Ms. Zambello is developing several new musicals, including Little House on the Prairie and The First Wives Club. She made her Broadway debut as director of Disney's newest stage production, The Little Mermaid, which opened on January 10th, 2008. Please welcome Ms. Francesca Zambello.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Everybody here okay? Can everybody hear okay? Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here in this esteemed and august institution. I want to thank the Gotlieb Archives. I want to thank Vita Palladino, who so kindly contacted me a few years ago about giving my archives to here. And at that point, I thought, what a fantastic idea. It could mean that I could reclaim my garage. As a director, one accumulates a great deal of paperwork and drawings and all sorts of things. And so I was amazed to think that starting my life directing puppet theater under the piano when I was 4 would end up with me here this evening and bringing so much to this institution. So I'm very, very grateful to everybody involved with it, who's friends of the library, friends of this archival center. Thank you very, very much. So that was quite a little buildup when he said my life and my career. I thought, oh God, I better deliver now. When you work in the theater is, of course, is a very ephemeral art form. It's all about live. It's all about here and now and just that one moment when it all comes together. So to have the opportunity to leave a little bit of a legacy in terms of photos and papers and one's work is quite an honor. But mostly what drew me to the theater and what keeps me in the theater is the fact that what I do is only for this moment. The experience that we share in the theater, you, I, the audience, performers, what happens on the night is something that is so unique and so treasured and so different from so much of the world that we live in today in terms of video and DVDs, and that's not to say that those are not an important part of our life, but as a director and an artist working in the theater, I believe very much in doing absolutely everything that I can to make people come to the theater. I think it's incumbent upon me, it's my responsibility to create theater that reaches the widest audience possible, to make new theater, to rethink operas, to present works in as many different kinds of ways, in different theaters and different settings and developing new works, whether they be musicals or new operas, that will make a legacy of theater. Because theater is, in a way, is the oldest art form. There was always somebody out there doing something for somebody else. There was always the performer and the audience. And that basic human primal connection of the moment and something live is something that I believe very, very strongly in, and mostly have dedicated myself to doing that. Now, how does one actually end up becoming a director or getting here? As I was coming here, I ruminated. I don't really have a personal connection with BU. I certainly have friends who graduated from here. But I do have a rather long connection with Boston, which in some way led me down the path of becoming a director. In 1912, which is almost 100 years ago, my grandparents got off of a boat from Naples in Boston Harbor. My grandfather was a shoemaker. My grandmother was a seamstress. They settled in Somerville. They loved music. They loved opera. They were very poor. They had come from a farm outside of Naples. My father was born shortly after World War I, and he was the oldest of 7 children. And he, like his father before him, was obsessed with music and with opera. They had an accordion, and they played the accordion on the steps of a house in Somerville where his 7 or 8 siblings and all the various relatives, of which there were many, of course, gathered in the evenings to sing for each other, to sing songs, Neapolitan songs, Italian arias, things that were, of course, for everybody, because opera in the 19th century was for everybody. It was the populist art form. So that sense of music started back then. My father left home when he was 16 to become an actor in New York City. Left behind that world, although that world stayed alive for me for a long time, even as a child. My grandmother died in Somerville. She was still a seamstress when she died. My grandfather died in that chocolate factory, Schraff's. He ended up working there after he couldn't make shoes anymore. So I have a connection with Boston, and it brought me rather humbly back to it today as I thought about it. But what was interesting was that my father set off for New York. He ended up meeting my mother, who was an actress there. They met after World War II. They both had served abroad. She was in USO, and he was a soldier. And they, of course, were performers and living in New York and living that dream of wanting to have the great big career. So when people say, well, where did theater come from? Some people have no connection with theater in their family. I had a big connection. Both of my parents were performers. My father ended up becoming a businessman, but there was this love that never left him for the theater, and so I feel very, very blessed that as a child I was around the theater, around opera, around music all the time. I don't think that that's necessary for a career in the arts. I just think that I'm very, very fortunate, so that when I was 4 years old, I was already had a puppet theater under my piano and was already directing. I was a control freak. I mean, that's basically what it all boiled down to. I didn't ever want to be a performer, and I think that's because having parents who do perform, you immediately realize the life of an actor is horrible. It's terrible. I mean, they're completely dependent on so many other people, whereas a director, all jokes aside, you are in control as long as you get the job. And so how does one make that long journey from sort of having the idea of playing with the puppets and playing with the piano to end up being a director? It's not something that there is a path. There's no established route to get here. And I thought I'd just talk first a little bit about that chronological side of things and then tell you a bit about how actually one does one's job today. Growing up around the theater was in my blood. At an early age, I was often backstage with my parents, waiting in the dressing room because my mother didn't want to spend the money on a babysitter, so I would be in the dressing room, and at the end of the show, she would take me and we would go home. We lived in New York City. But I spent a lot of time standing in the wings, watching from the wings, which is quite exciting if you're 6 years old or 7 years old, because you have this incredible view on the world of what's real and what's not real, of something that's so incredibly theatrical. Seeing performers up close is very, very different than seeing it from a distance, and that made an indelible mark on me and made me decide that I wanted to live in the world of backstage. I wanted to live in the world where we would see things on the horizon. We would see the whole picture, not just the way performers see things down a tunnel. And so I set out on that path. By high school, I was already directing the plays, encouraging other friends to write as well. And we were very fortunate because my father luckily stopped being an actor. I don't think he was a very good actor, and became a businessman and decided that he wanted to move back to Europe. And so we moved back to France when I was 12. And yeah, France. Why not? You mean, why didn't you go back to Italy? There's no, people can't work in Italy. Italy is just for good wine, food, and seeing some good shows. All right, you can't make a good living there. And that economy and those politics, impossible. Anyway, so we moved to France, and I was there for what you might call the more impressionable formative years of junior high and high school. And while I was there, my mother continued working in the theater, doing theater in English. I got jobs at that point dubbing French movies into English. I learned how to do that. But more importantly, I began to not only direct, but like many kids in high school, become involved in the whole thing, in the designing, in the making it happen, in the putting it together. And I was very fortunate that I went to school at a time where all the arts were part of schools and were an integral part of one's education, which sadly, as we know now, seems to be something that's lacking for a lot of kids. So I can only hope that all of us here will do everything to encourage the arts as much as possible. I don't think this group wouldn't be here if you didn't care about it, so I feel like I'm preaching to the converted, so I won't drone on about that. When we ended up leaving France and moving to Vienna, and at that point I got a job on weekends. I was a senior in high school by then, working as an extra at the Vienna State Opera. Now, an extra, or a supernumerary as they're called in opera, was a fantastical experience. I didn't really know a lot about opera. I'd seen a number of operas, but I didn't really understand the makings of it and how it all worked together. And suddenly, there I was experiencing this huge art form and this huge amount of stagecraft and technology, which, as you can imagine, was far more exciting than my high school efforts, and one that really, really drew me in. I thought at that point then it was clear that I definitely wanted to be a director and that opera was maybe even a possibility, but it didn't sort of become a reality at that point. I was wise enough, or maybe my parents were wise enough to realize you've got to go out and get a good education because you can't study to be a director. Directing is part of directing is just living life and then being able to bring it all together on the stage. I went to college at Colgate, and then, as I said before, I went to the University of Moscow for a year, actually because it was the cheapest study group at that time. It was 1976. Everybody else wanted to go to France, and I'd already lived there, so nobody wanted to go to the Soviet Union at that point. So I ended up getting a grant where there was a group of 8 of us who went to the Soviet Union in 1976. That was depressing time then, I can assure you. It was very depressing and great, but the study group for 1 year was $1,000. So I know, it's cheap. Can you imagine now? Tuitions are a whole other thing. Anyway, so off we went to Moscow for a year, and for me it was an incredible eye-opener about everything Russian in terms of not just culture and language and art, but theater and music, and the fact that you could see a play there every night. Didn't always understand it until I learned to speak Russian better, but that you could see a play every night at the Stanislavski's Theater, at the Moscow Art Theater, for 2 kopecks a night, which is less than half a penny. And so that experience was phenomenal. And after that, I went to London for a semester, where these were sort of the great days of the beginning of the National Theatre in the 77, 78, where, again, I was a student and was able to see so much theater for 25 pence then. I mean, now the prices, as we all know, have become astronomical. But these experiences make that kind of mark on a young person that I think eventually led me to be committed to this path. After I got out of college, I moved to New York like most people and got a job working off Broadway for 58 cents a week, living on the West Side, which of course now is so incredibly chic. I lived in a building where my rent was $100 a month. And I remember there was a murder on the 4th floor. I lived on the 3rd floor. And then on New Year's Eve of the year that I was living there, a fire started below me, and I was sleeping. And suddenly I thought, why is the floor smoking? So these are all the experiences that you have when you move to New York. Anyway, what was great was I got a job as a stage manager. And to become a director, it's not like you just go out and say, okay, I'm going to direct. I had all this sort of great information and knowledge and learning and whatnot. But you really have to put in your galley years in the theater. And so I went and I worked at the Public Theater. Joe Papp ran the theater then, where I was a stage manager. And a stage manager is basically the person who helps coordinate everything that the director wants, along with all the technical aspects of a production. It was a wonderful learning experience, a great time to be there. Many wonderful actors and performances went through there. But I realized that theater at that time in the 70s in New York, there was a lot happening. It was fascinating and interesting, and the downtown scene was something. But I, in a way, wanted to go back to Europe. I wanted that sense of something that wasn't so naturalistic. A lot of American theater in the 70s felt very naturalistic and realistic and too weighted down in a kind of TV style of acting. I wanted something bigger visually, something more stimulating. So I went back to Europe. I went to Frankfurt at the time, and I got a job at the Frankfurt Opera House, being what's called an hospitant, which is really a glorified way of saying a gopher. But being a gopher is a good thing, and a lot of times now people look down on that, but it was a great way. You get to hang around a lot of rehearsals, get a lot of coffee, and of course become an expert at the Xerox machine and how all those things work. And I got to experience a lot of productions, and most notably I met someone there who was the dramaturg at the Frankfurt Opera House who brought me to Bayreuth, which for anybody who's an opera aficionado is the temple of Wagner. For better or worse. And there I was, of course, another glorified gopher for a summer where I was witnessing the Patrice Chéreau Ring in its revival. And so these are the kind of experiences that were obviously seminal and crucial and can't be repeated. You can't plan them. You can only look back and think, my God, I was so lucky. How did I stumble on that? Somebody said to me once that luck is something that only happens when you work really hard. So I guess I was working hard at that time. And by this point, I realized that this was definitely my calling, that it was the world of theater and very much the world of opera, particularly during my 20s, that drew my fantasy, that drew me into another universe, into a way to express oneself that was greater than perhaps just the world around us, and that theater and music had a calling that could reach an international audience, speak to us universally. So after that, I came back to the States, and by now I was sort of pretty self-assured. I'd been working in Europe and blah, 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 and came back to America hoping to get a job, and didn't get one for about 6 months. And then there was an institute called the National Opera Institute, which sadly we don't have these things anymore. It was a government agency that used to give money to young people who wanted to work in opera. And I managed to get a grant for a year from them to follow various directors around in America. And I did that and met various directors, most notably a gentleman named Jean-Pierre Pinel, who was a very esteemed opera director who's since passed away. And he hired me by some miracle to come and work for him. And so back I went to Europe and got to work at a variety of theaters in Europe. But I also wanted very much at this point to start directing on my own. You can only work for other people so long. Eventually, directing is like, it's like writing, it's like painting. You can look at other people, you can copy, you can assist, you can help. But until you do it yourself, you don't know how hard it is. And that's the point where you learn to shut up and just say, okay, now I really see how difficult it is. So I was fortunate. I went by some fluke, to Milwaukee, that metropolis of culture. And there's a theater there called the Skylight. At that time, it was called the Skylight Comic Opera. And the guy who ran the company, who since has died, and they put his ashes underneath the stage to honor him, which I always love, anyway, he said, sure, I'll hire you to direct something. So he asked me to direct, and the theater, mind you, was the size of this stage, basically. I'm serious. The audience was about 3 rows, and then the stage was about half this size. Anyway, he hired me to direct the Macropolis case by Janacek, which is one of the most difficult operas in the world, God knows why. Totally fantastical, wonderful, dark, strange piece. And so I directed it, and then I knew at that point there was no turning back. I didn't want to assist anybody. I didn't want to work for anybody else. I didn't want to be a stage manager. I only wanted to do it myself, come hell or high water, and that I wanted to make theater that spoke from my heart and that would reach people as best as I could. So from there, luckily, you know, once you start to get those first few breaks, if you don't screw up, things go okay. I know he said my official debut was here and there, but I really consider my debut was the Skylight. And then I went on to be hired in Houston, where I directed Fidelio, which was a sort of a door opener. It's always that thing of, if you do something right, the door will open to the next thing. And as an artist, you have to be able to, people always say, well, what about if you take a job doing this or that? I say, you can't. You have to leave yourself open in the theater. You have to be willing to say, okay, I don't have a job now, I'll go wait tables or I'll do whatever, which luckily I didn't have to, but you can't just plan it. The theater is completely serendipitous. You don't know what's going to happen next. Anyway, after I worked in Houston, I went back to Europe and got a job. My first job in Europe was directing at the now burnt down La Fenice in Italy. Now they've rebuilt it, where I directed Beatrice di Tenda. And it was, for me, one of those events where I thought, this is fantastic. It's my European debut. Everything is going great. And then on the day of the opening, because it was Italy, there was a strike. And that happens a lot in Italy. That happens a lot. I can't tell you how often that happens. Anyway, they had a strike. And then on the second performance, which became the opening, we had Acqua Alta, which if you've ever been in Venice, you know that's the flooding that comes. And so just at the start of the performance, the floods started coming, so everybody had to run out of the theater. Finally, it opened on the third performance. It was terrible. It was a disaster. I didn't do a good job, and I knew it at the time, but at least it was one of those things I can look back on and think, well, it led me to something else. I spent a large part of those years in my late 20s, early 30s, working a lot in Italy. There were a lot of provincial theaters where I seemed to get jobs. I was happy working there. I could do a lot of what's important for a director, which is called new productions, productions where you conceive all of the designs and the ideas, what it's going to look like. You're very often involved in the casting, the putting together of it. Concurrent with this, I ended up coming back to that nice little theater in Milwaukee called the Skylight, which I ran it for 7 years. I ended up becoming the artistic director for 7 years, which was a great experience because I had my own box. I had my own magic place to work inside of, which is crucial. I could decide everything we were doing, what operas we were doing, who was going to be in them, what they looked like, absolutely everything about it. And our budget for every show was, I think, about $10,000, which is, of course, a drop in the bucket now. But it was vital because it gave one a complete sense of creative freedom and the ability to do anything and everything. Once these sort of two different worlds of Europe and Milwaukee started fusing together, I started to get to the next level of a career, which I feel very grateful for, and started to work in some of the bigger houses where it's funny, you make your name because you think, okay, I've directed at La Scala and the Met and San Francisco and the Royal Opera House, but in a way it's always those smaller theaters and those smaller companies and those experiences which end up defining you artistically, which are the things that you often care the most about. Whereas the other places certainly give you prestige and a name, they're not always the most satisfying experiences creatively. That's not to say they're bad, though. Let me just stress they're pretty wonderful, some of them. And so I feel very fortunate in the last decade or so. I've had the chance to work with so many of the world's greatest artists in theater and in opera, in venues around the world, connecting different people. And as I started to get into my 40s, I began to realize that what was really important to me was how to make opera more accessible to more people, how to make new operas that were accessible, how to make theater pieces that would reach new audiences, families, children, how to create that legacy that I mentioned before about how to make new theater, to make live theater part of everybody's lives. And to that end, for the last 10 years or so, I have been working a lot to develop new pieces. One piece actually was here in Boston a few years ago. It was The Little Prince, which was mentioned in the introduction. It was a family opera that we originally did in Houston, which ended up being filmed by the BBC, and we had a lovely run of it here at, I think it's called the Wang Theater or the Colonial Theater, I can't remember, sorry. The Boston Lyric Opera. It was fabulous. Oh, good, you're great. Oh, good, it's louder on that. Okay, good, okay. Great, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Okay, right. Well, we're happy that it was here, and I'm happy that it brought in a lot of new audiences. So that was, for me, the sort of became something crucial to my thinking about theater, was that we need to be making theater for bigger audiences. Hence, of course, going to work for somebody like Disney, who gives you the chance and a little bit more money to do theater on the widest possible range to reach the newest audiences and to create, hopefully, audiences for tomorrow. So that's a bit of how I got from that boat from Naples to here. And now I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what actually happens when you do a production. I see that they've done a fabulous job with some pictures back here of various productions, so bravo on that, thank you. And I hope you'll all get a chance to look at them. Each production back there brought back some very wonderful memories of different shows along the way. I thought I'd talk a little bit about, I guess most people here are opera lovers, or theater. I want to sort of pick what would be a good, let's hear the opera lovers. It looks like I'm sure you outweigh the theater lovers. Theater lovers? Oh, okay. All right, theater. Okay, I'm going to tell a little bit about an opera and a little bit about a musical. How about that? How they come together, because they're not necessarily the same in a funny way. Doing an opera, let's say the Met, because the Met's always a good gossip. I've directed a number of things at the Met. Some have been a bit controversial, and some have been very popular. Since there's some pictures back there of Cyrano de Bergerac, I'll tell you a little bit about that. That was a production I did at the Met a few years ago, which we actually just did at La Scala this month, which was made for Placido Domingo. So when you do a new production of an opera, what generally happens is the general director of the theater, in this case, Joe Volpe, now it's Peter Gelb who runs the Met, they call you up and they say, we want you to do this particular show. Are you interested? You generally say yes, and what are you going to say? No. And then you meet with the general director to plan. As a director, it then falls into your court to decide, what does it look like? What does the production look like? What are the designs, the set designs, the costume designs? Who is going to sing in it? I mean, in this case, it was Placido. Placido wanted to do it, but usually you begin to talk about all the different singers who might do the roles. Sometimes you do auditions where you hear various people to see if they're right for that role. And this process usually takes about 3 years. When you see a performance, it's usually been about 3 years from the conception till it gets on stage. The first year is generally about figuring out who's going to be in the cast. And designs. The design process means you hire the designer, the set designer, the costume designer, the lighting designer, and the choreographer. I meet with them and discuss the conceptual ideas. What's it going to look like? What period is it set in? Where should we do our research? How are we going to approach the piece? What is the environment that we want the piece to live inside of? So it's all of that really big conceptual process that takes up the first part of the development. Now, that's not to say that you're doing that for a year straight, but rather it's something that, it's like cooking a stew very slowly. You go back to it every couple of months to discover, what should we do now? Do we want the walls blue? Do we want the walls green? Do we want to set it in something abstract and something realistic, something more contemporary? You then, with the designers, you generally make a model. If anybody's ever done a big renovation, you know how the contractor comes with a model and the drawings and everything looks great until the reality sets in, i.e. the price tag. Well, that's like the theater too. You get all the great ideas going and then you bid it out. You work with the technical departments of a theater to figure out how much it's going to cost. And once you realize how much it's going to cost, they usually tell you to cut it in half. And once you get through that, you discern really what it's going to look like. You then get to the whole notion of it goes off, it gets built, they build the costumes, they build the set, and then you get to the rehearsals. Well, rehearsing usually takes for an opera about 6 weeks from start to finish. You usually start by having musical rehearsals with the conductor where you collaborate on, is this going to be loud? Is this going to be soft? Is this going to be faster? Is this going to be slower? Often they want it to be slower and you want it to be faster. It's a general thing between directors and conductors. The singers, of course, then work with you, the director, in terms of their characters, how to portray a certain role, how does the character act, how does the character react, how do they move. You spend a lot of time just discussing that often at a table with the singers, deciding how you're going to tell the story, how the characters connect to each other. You then begin the process of staging something, what people actually do on the stage, where do they stand on the stage, what do they have a prop, how are they saying something to somebody, how are they singing it to somebody. And in an opera, of course, there's a big element that you don't have in theater, which is the chorus. Often you'll have a chorus of 100 people. Some operas, I mean, when I did War and Peace, I had almost 200 choristers on stage and 100 extras, the entire Russian army. And so you working with a chorus is very different because you're basically dealing with 100 people, telling them what to do, how to move as they sing. And this is a slow process. It takes a long time. You often in a day will only usually get through about 10 minutes of an opera. Let's say you have a 3-hour opera, and a lot of operas are 6-hour operas. You might only get through staging 10 or 15 minutes a day of something. You do all this work with just a piano in a room, very similar to this kind of room usually. You want to have a big space where you can have enough to suggest what the set would be like, the size of the space that you're going to work in. And then once you get all that done, you go on to the stage. And the stage is, then you get the scenery. You add a different component, a new component. And then suddenly, in a room when you're rehearsing, there are usually lines on the floor suggesting the scenery or the steps. And then suddenly you get on the stage and there are real steps. And everybody goes, oh my gosh, you didn't tell me those steps were right there. And they say, I told you it was in the room, it was on the floor. Once you get through that kind of hurdle of making things work on stage with the set, pulling all those elements together that you'd planned 3 years ago when you had the model box in the other room, and suddenly now it's all right there in front of you. It slowly starts to come together. Also, then you add an ingredient every couple of days. You add in the costumes so that people, of course, begin to adapt to their costumes. Costumes take a long time to make, especially period costumes. They're expensive and they take a long time to make. Singers have extensive fittings, usually 4 or 5 fittings for a costume in a period piece. Once you've got all that together, you're still only working with piano. You then add the orchestra, which is a whole other element, which then throws everybody into a tizzy because they're suddenly, it doesn't sound the same, it's louder, it's softer, I can't see the conductor. And then slowly, in these final rehearsals, you add lights, things, am I standing in the light? There's a lot of that. And you slowly put all these different elements together. As the director, you are responsible for all of this. So you basically are trying to spoon feed, placate, babysit, lead the troops, take care of everybody, as well as try to accomplish some kind of big vision about what you're doing. So by the time you get to opening night, you often just want to go to the bar. But actually, no, it's usually a great feeling by the time you get to an opening, particularly of a big opera, because in a way the music lifts everything up. And as a director, you see this sense of your entire vision of what you thought it would look like, how you have brought it all together. And it's frightening in a way, because when you start out, you're just starting with those very simple ideas of those very simple pieces of what scenery looks like or how you're going to tell the story, what it's going to look like. When you do a musical, it's a longer process, and in a way, more complicated because you generally are also dealing with the commercial world versus the not-for-profit world. Opera lives in the world of not-for-profit, which means we're very grateful to donors and to patrons and to people who give money, of which I have a feeling some of you might be. So I want to say a special thanks for everybody who supports the arts, because we couldn't do it without you. But in commercial theater, it's very different. You're not working for a general director, a Peter Gelb or a Joe Volpe. You're working for a producer. So there's a lot more of the kind of like, you better make it good or we're not going to make any money. So it's a very, you're entering into it in a very different way. So suddenly it's not just all about creativity and artistry, but about, can we afford it? Will we make our money back? How long will it take to make our money back? But as a director, you try to put all that aside, and you try to get that in the back of your mind, and you try to think, how am I going to do this? Right now, I have a couple different musicals running in different places. One of them is Rebecca musical running in Vienna. The other is Little Mermaid, we just heard about on Broadway, and the other is a musical called Aladdin, which is running in Disneyland. So if anybody's been in Disneyland, you may have seen that. That's been there for about 5 years, and Rebecca's been running for about 3 years, and Little Mermaid's been open just a few months. Now, something like The Little Mermaid is very different than other musicals because it's based on, just the process of that was a several-year process. But in a way, it follows very much that same notion for a director. You have to develop a visual idea. You have to develop a concept of how we're going to do that, whatever show it is. In that case, it was how to create a parallel universe because most of the people are underwater for the entire show. I saw some nice drawings back there. You can get a sense of some of the costumes and what they look like back in that case back there. That for me was interesting because I worked with frequent opera designer collaborators who we had done two Russian designers actually. We had done some things in Russia together and in Europe together, and it seemed like they had the right aesthetic to bring this together. And so it was really all about finding a way to not have people swimming underwater or pretending they're swimming, but rather to create a universe that is very much light and fiberglass and beautiful and reflective to suggest water without putting tons of water on the stage. Also, when you do a musical, there's a huge thing, which is the fact that the composer is not dead. The composer is there, which is a great thing because you have a chance to work with living writers. And as a director, a large part of your job is just that. It is about bringing the script into being, bringing the music into being, working with them to always answer the basic story, which is storytelling. We're storytellers. That's what directors do. That's our job description on the tax form, storyteller. And so in the case of something like The Little Mermaid, I spent several years working with Alan Menken and the lyricist Glenn Slater and the playwright Doug Wright on bringing the script together as well as trying to bring together the visual world. We did, as you often do in musicals, you do things called workshops and readings where you hear the music and you read the script out loud with a group of actors for a various, in this case, muck-de-mucks at Disney, but if you're doing another kind of show for producers and investors, so that people can decide, is this show worth putting on? Is this show worth spending the money? And we're constantly auditioning, that's how I look at it. In that case, Disney gave it the green light, and we then spent several years developing the script, developing the visual concept, and now, thankfully, it's running on Broadway, so I can start to look a little bit to the future. That's one of the great things about directing, is that you're never doing the same thing. You're always doing something new. You're always thinking about new projects and new ideas. I feel fortunate that the couple of the new projects that I'm working on are very much something that's looking forward to the future. As I said before, it's important to me about getting people into a theater, getting audiences there. And that's why, obviously, working for somebody like Disney, you know that you're going to get families there, but also you're going to hopefully get families there who are bringing their kids, who are going to be the audience of tomorrow, who are going to be people who, once they are in the theater, will come again. One of the rather sad facts of America is that we know that only 1 in 100 people in their lives see a live performance. That is not this room, thankfully. But that is something, to me, it's a figure that I would love to change. It's something that I think that theater should be a part of everybody's life every day. So now as I start to look on new projects, I begin to think hopefully to the future and to new ideas, to new ways of reaching new audiences, new ways of hopefully developing what's going to come in our future. But I have to say I am very, very grateful to have a little bit of one's legacy here in Boston, back here, and in the archives here. So to that, I thank everyone involved with that, and I would love to turn this over to a few questions. Thank you. Thank you. Now don't be shy. Are we going to be shy? Yes, sir, with the red scarf. I'll repeat the question if we don't have a mic.
Tell me, how do you handle a major voice?
How do you handle a major voice? Okay, I've been very fortunate and blessed to work with some major voices. Pavarotti was my first big voice. In 1986, I directed La Bohème with Pavarotti and Mirella Freni at the San Francisco Opera, and it was then filmed for DVD. When you work with a big voice, that kind of big singer, of course you're making compromises in terms of directing, in terms of what certain people can do, but there are also certain glories and fabulous things. The fact that some people have incredible voices but may not be able to do everything that you want on stage. In a mere 20 years of a career, though, I have watched the great voices become able to do anything. I've worked often with Renee Fleming, Debbie Voigt, Susan Graham, Placido. These are all people who, in a way, are really, truly the most consummate artists of our time, I think, because they are amazing singers. They are unique singers. They have voices that you will never forget. But they also are great interpreters. They are people who work with you very hard in the rehearsal room. We spend a lot of time developing characters, developing the roles, working on them together. So in a sense, working with those kind of people, it's like driving a Mercedes-Benz. You feel that you are working with the people who are at the top of their game and are the most interested in creating the most vivid, live, operatic, and theatrical performances. And so in a sense, it's the most satisfying are those kind of moments. I mean, that's not to say there aren't also compromise moments with great voices. I directed Tristan and Isolde with Ben Heppner and Jane Eaglin. It was both of their first essays at the role. It was about 8 years ago. Now, they're large people. I mean, let's not kid around. They're large people, and but they're great artists, and they're willing to work. That's not, they can't run around the stage, but they do an amazing job. And so I had a whole concept where the set moved a lot since they didn't move a lot. And it was a good production. It was very well, and so of course they've gone on to become great interpreters of the roles. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Television or film held any interest for you?
Has television or film held any interest for me? To be truthful, yes, but not like, you have to have a burning desire to work in those mediums the way that I feel I have a burning desire in these. I have directed for TV a lot, but it's always been directing something that I directed on stage. Film is, you have to have that passion. I mean, I always say you can't do this if you're not willing to give blood every day. I mean, so in a sense, yes, I am a great admirer of many amazing directors in those mediums, but it's not something that I want to chuck this part of my career aside and go pursue it. Because I'm still in the live theater mode. I really am. I do think that those things, aside from being art forms in themselves, a lot of course, the internet and media and video have helped opera and live theater in many ways, but they will never replace the experience, I think. Yes, sir. What are my upcoming projects? Well, I am doing this new musical, The Little House on the Prairie, which will be at the Gotlieb Theatre this summer in Minneapolis. It's a pre-Broadway tryout. Basically, nowadays, that's a way that people go. You do a show out of town to decide, is it any good? That's with the composer Rachel Portman, who wrote The Little Prince, who's an Oscar winner. The book is by a woman named Rachel Scheinkin, who wrote Spelling Bee. And we're doing it at the Guthrie, and then we'll see what happens. It's starring Melissa Gilbert as the mother. And I'm going to New York tomorrow to start auditioning young girls to play the role of Laura. Then next year, I'm developing now a new musical based on the First Wives Club with a book by Rupert Holmes and music by the Motown Kings, Holland Dozier Holland, who wrote everything for the Supremes, Marvin Gaye, Aretha Franklin. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I'm doing the Ring Cycle, Wagner's Ring Cycle, at the Kennedy Center, which I've already done Rheingold and Valkyrie, and I'll be doing Siegfried and Götterdämmerung next year. And that I've taken very much an approach of treating the Ring Cycle through America. It's set in America. It very much follows an evolution of the 19th and 20th century of America and how we have destroyed our environment. Which is very much, was of course Wagner's intention in the piece, how the gods have taken hold of the gold and ruined everything, and how then of course it goes back to nature. So those are the big projects for the next 2 years or so. Yes, sir.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. I was wondering, with the numerous places that you've resided in, how many languages you speak, and how is it you overcame not having a foreign accent?
Well, I'm
also,
American. I am American.
No, I realize that, but you spent a lot of your youth in
No,
foreign
I
countries.
speak French, Italian, German, and Russian. And I speak them all pretty well, but I have an accent. I mean, not a thick accent, but I have an accent. And of course, as a director, your primary tool of communicating is language. I mean, yes, of course I act things out a lot for people, but language is your tool, so being able to communicate is crucial. Although I have worked in Japan and Cambodia and other places where I could not talk, I did a lot of acting out. Yeah.
Yep, thank you. And then I was wondering, how do you negotiate your compensation? What are the factors
Are you
that
a
come
lawyer?
into play? No.
I have an agent, William Morris. They negotiate my compensation. I'm surprised you're concerned. That's it. I've never had anybody ask that question. I think that's interesting. I have an agent. It's William Morris, and I'll tell you only this much: that basically, when you work in the commercial world, you make royalties. If a show does well, you make a percentage. In the not-for-profit world, you make a fee. You make a flat fee for what you direct. Is that enough information? Okay. Yes, sir. These guys here, these two guys had a question. Yes.
Well, I was surprised you said you were looking in Europe for Laura.
No, I'm looking in New York tomorrow for Laura. I'm auditioning tomorrow morning for Laura's. Or why, did you want to audition?
Maybe New York is too far east for Laura.
No, it's where all the young girls are. All the 20-year-old girls who just graduated from BU. Right. Yes, sir.
Francesca, thank you. It's not working. A Boston history of many people come here and tell us how they got where they are. Now we understand where you are.
Okay.
So I'm an engineer.
You're an engineer.
And I need a formula for understanding the new plays.
This man is an engineer. He needs a formula for understanding the new plays.
Sweeney Todd.
Sweeney Todd.
Nobody goes away singing the tunes.
Nobody goes away singing the
But you're
tunes.
enthusiastic about it, so how do you approach that?
I am
How did you get
enthusiastic about it.
enthusiastic, please?
I am enthusiastic. Sweeney Todd is a genius work of Stephen Sondheim's. There are a lot of tunes in that piece. Joanna, it's one of the great tunes in it that Anthony sings about Joanna. Swing Your Razor High, Sweeney's aria. I mean, there's a lot of great music in that. I mean, I think Stephen Sondheim. I think that basically, I basically think that musical theater is the opera of today. I think that it is the thing that reaches audience the way that opera did in the 19th century. I mean, I know that's a broad statement and overly simplified, but I think that that's what it does. I think Sweeney Todd is a genius work. There is no formula. You're an engineer, so I wish I could give you a formula. But if there was a formula for art, art would not exist. You know, and that's why. I mean, that's why we love people like you, because you keep coming to us. Because you keep saying, help me solve this. I mean, art is the thing that helps us understand our lives, that helps put things in some kind of perspective, that makes us why do we keep listening to Mozart? Why do we keep reading Shakespeare? Because they're mirrors of our own life, and we can filter it through our world to understand our world better. Stephen Sondheim, I think, is a genius. Not always. I think Sweeney Todd is one of his greatest works. So I wish I could help you with that. I think there are tunes in that piece. Okay? Yes, sir.
Compare the difference between
working...
working...
he's a baritone, this guy. We can hear him loud and clear.
I don't
okay.
need it. Can you compare the difference between working in opera, where there may be 100 years of performance by world-famous singers, directors, and so on, with working in the musical theater, where tomorrow night is opening night, and no one has ever seen this before.
Right.
And my creation
right.
is thought out from 0. What's the difference?
Well, the difference, as far as I'm concerned, is there is a difference, but there also is one basic thing which unites them, which is that our job, my job, is the storyteller. Our, meaning the collective, everybody who works with me, is we're interpreters. We're interpreters of Wagner the same way we're interpreters of Stephen Sondheim. We have to understand the material for ourselves and then interpret it and express it to an audience. In that sense, storytelling doesn't change. That's the assignment. You know, I get up in the morning, I say, I got to tell a story today. That's my job. But how one works, the practicality. It's working with a living composer is different because things change every day. There's no question. They change every day when you're working on a new musical. Songs change, things move around, everything changes. And that's what you have to deal with, and you have to be wanting to work with that. With opera, it exists. It's on the printed page. The score is a Bible. What Puccini wrote, it's a Bible. And so that's what you use. But you have to find ways when you do those works that exist to rediscover them. You don't have to reinvent them. I'm not advocating that. I'm advocating that we examine them, that we make them our own, that we don't try to replicate anything that came before. I mean, we interpret it our own way. That's why Andy Warhol painted the same painting of The Last Supper the same way that Michelangelo did. I mean, art is interpreted through every different age. And so that's, for me, it's the same thing, whether it's Puccini or whether it's Alan Menken. I just think, okay, I got to get up and figure out how to do it. Some days it's not. The practical side's a little difficult when things are changing and it's like you're on slippery ice. It's also very different, I have to say, working with opera singers and working with actors. That is different because opera singers, when they come to rehearsals, they know the part. When they get there, they know the music. They've memorized it. When actors come, they open the script the first day and the binding cracks. And that's how you do it. But that's just a different process. And process eventually leads to good products, hopefully. Yes, ma'am.
Young theater, the college-age theater and opera students coming out of our university, for instance, Boston University, that they really have an adequate liberal arts background, history and literature, or do you need to supply that to them?
I think, first of all, I'd like to say I taught a master class today in the Opera Institute with some of the vocal students and some of the music theater students, and under the auspices of Sharon Daniels, who runs that department. I don't know if she's here tonight. Is she here tonight? Sharon Daniels, is she here tonight? No. Anyway, she did a fantastic job. I think the kids there are amazing, so I was really, really impressed with the kids here. In terms of liberal arts education, No, I think that nowadays people they are not educated properly. People do not know how to think for themselves. They are, it's tough. I encounter this constantly where I'll have a room of 20-something-year-olds in a show, and they have amazing energy and life and desire, but they do not have a thought process of how to think. I mean, of course, there are plenty that do, but a lot of times they don't. And that's because I think a lot of institutes that train people in the performing arts train them to be that, performers. They don't train them to have a basis. And I think that that's one of the most important things, is how to think, I mean, whenever I talk to students, performers, I always say, have you been to the museums where you are? Have you experienced culturally? Have you read a book? I mean that it's a problem because it's so easy. I mean, we used to have to go to the library and the Dewey Decimal System and look everything up, and nowadays you can Google it. And of course, I'm just as guilty, but in a sense, I mean, when I learned The Marriage of Figaro, of course, I read the Beaumarchais play, and then I read everything about the French Revolution, and then I mean, that's how you learn pieces. And it's a problem. So it could be better. It could be better.
Involved in the singer, or do you have special coaches that are always?
No, I do it. Basically, I mean, if I'm directing something has some kind of classical background. I mean, like when I directed I make people do that. Well, I do it with them sometimes. I mean, when I directed Iphigenie and Tauride, of course, we went back and read the play together, all the singers. I mean, you a lot of times as a director, it's your job to help give people the background. If they don't have it themselves, you want to give it to them. That's the way it goes. We have a different training system. Yes, sir.
Obviously, have had some wonderful experiences in Europe and obviously in this country. Do you have some thoughts about the theater in Latin America?
Some theater in Latin America? Did you say Latin America? Well, I did work in South America. I've never worked in Latin America. I have great respect, certainly for writers there. One of the most beautiful experiences I had was I worked with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He wrote the libretto for an opera. This is one of his unknown secrets. And it was called Florencia in the Amazon. It was with a Mexican composer. And I went to Colombia, to Marquez's estate. This was about in 1995, I think. And I spent a couple weeks there working with him on the plot of the opera, and then he wrote the libretto, and then the Mexican composer Daniel Catan wrote the opera. It's in Spanish, and we did it in Colombia, which working there was tricky. It was very tricky. A lot of bodyguards. When I went to Marquez's estate, I flew there in a helicopter, an open helicopter, which I'll never do again. And there were two guys with machine guns on both sides of me. Because he was constantly being threatened. His life was constantly being threatened. So that was my big experience in South America, and that kind of did it for me. That was enough. I think there was a great tradition there, and there certainly is great opera houses there. They have many fantastic singers have come. I heard a wonderful Mexican tenor today, actually, who was in the program, a young man named Eduardo Jimenez. And there are many great singers from South America. That's my experience there. Obviously, you're from Latin America, I'm guessing. Sorry? El Salvador. I don't know the tradition there of El Salvador, but I have a fit. Okay, I think we might be heading to the last question. Yes. That would be you with the red hair.
I was just wondering if there was any particular work of literature, or myth, or legend that has not been made into an opera or theater piece, as far as you know, that you would like to do.
I'm sure there is. I don't know. It's not on the tip of my tongue. There is a book that I'm working on right now, which I can't say, which relates very much to 9/11 and the state of America and politics that I'm planning on turning into a theater piece, but that's not a piece of legend. I think I'd be more. It's hard finding pieces that you have to find something that speaks to you to develop it into something, and there are things, and when they come to you, they call to you and you do it. So I want to thank everybody for being a wonderful audience. Thank you for having me tonight. It was great to be here. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Zambello. You've given us a super Monday, especially after yesterday's sad surprise.
I'm from New York.
And now the bars have reopened.